Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It's great to be able to have an opportunity to do what we're trying to do here this evening with this very special Montreat Wednesday. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few thank yous. One is to Sam Weber and all of our friends at Black Mountain Presbyterian Church. They've been phenomenally helpful on the technical side and in other ways of helping us to put this project together. I also want to say a special thanks to Ann Seaman, who is kind of our technical director, as well as many, many other people on the Christian Education Committee and beyond, who are working together to make this possible tonight. And what we're trying to do here tonight is something fairly specific. We're trying to give ourselves some room, and hopefully in a safe place. This should be a safe place, for thinking through our responses to a piece of video footage that many people have had an opportunity to see, which was a conversation that took place recently between Dr. Bill Lee and Dr. George Anderson, two members of the clergy community in Roanoke, Virginia. If you've had a chance to see that video footage, you've seen that those two had a wonderful conversation where Dr. Anderson, who's the son of Jane and Ede Anderson, is offering Dr. Lee opportunities to speak as an African-American member of that clergy community in response to some of the events and many of the questions that were coming up in the immediate aftermath of the death of George Floyd. If you haven't yet had a chance to see that video footage, that's fine. You are just as much a part of this discussion as anyone else, and we're very glad that you're taking the time to be with us tonight. We won't have time for every question that could be asked, and we recognize that we are just scratching the surface. Again, this is not by any means a thoroughgoing examination of the whole topic of race in the United States. Instead, it's specifically an opportunity for all of us to reflect together on that one conversation, that hour-long discussion between Dr. Lee and Dr. Anderson. And so with that, I'd like to turn to our two panelists tonight. Ann DuPre Rogers is a licensed clinical social worker and the co-founder and executive director of Resources for Resilience. That's a nonprofit that's focused on resiliency and trauma, including racialized trauma and traumas of oppression. She's also an elder on the session at Montreat Presbyterian Church. Our other panelist tonight is Heath Rada. Heath has been moderator of the General Assembly of the U.S.A, in addition to having been head of the American Red Cross, president of the Presbyterian School of Christian Education, and well known in several other roles, and a familiar face and a great, great friend to many, many of us in Montreat and the surrounding areas as well. Heath is not only part of our own community, but he's also he's a member of Grace Covenant Presbyterian Church in Asheville. Both Ann DuPre and Heath have asked me to underscore that they are not here with any personal claim of being experts on racial matters whatsoever, but they have been invited by us to come and bring their observations and perspectives from what they do into our church family discussion, which is what this is meant to be. One last note, this is not a debate. It's not a debate between Ann DuPre and Heath. It's not a debate between me and anyone else. It's not a debate within members of our own community, and it's certainly not a political debate between two different sides. It's simply an opportunity for us to reflect on what we've heard in that conversation between Dr. Lee and Dr. Anderson in Roanoke. So as the bells ring, I'd like to turn it over to Ann DuPre and Heath, our panelists. Dr. Lee mentioned the desire for people in dialogue to come to a common understanding of the meaning of the word racism. What for you are some working definitions of racism? Heath, if I may start with you.
Racism is a word that has been used to both identify an issue, but also to separate people over the years. And as I think about a definition for racism, Keith, it would relate to issues of people who discriminate, where there is prejudice, where there is some element of separation between one group and another based on race. And that is all tied up with economics, with education, with so many aspects of our lives.
There's a lot of different ways to think about racism. There's a lot of different kind of working definitions. It's about power, it's about structures, it's about justifying being in position of power and other people not having that same access. I think the definition most recently that I read that I want to repeat comes from Tanesia Coates, who wrote Between the World and Me. And what he says, it's the need to ascribe bone-deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them.
Have you, and this is for either of you to respond, have you seen that in effect, and how have you seen that played out in the lives of the people who were victimized by it?
Well, as a social worker since the mid-90s, and a therapist working with families and children that are experiencing poverty and lack of power and lack of access, I have absolutely seen structures and occasions that have kept people in states of, fear and trauma and sort of a perpetuation of poverty and being on the margins. When you see structures in place that keep those people out, it's hard to not react and sort of make it your life's work to do something. So yeah, I saw it, I see it all the time in the work that I've done and now in the work that I'm doing. And from individual experiences like riding in the car with an African American man just one county over from Buncombe and him literally tensing up and saying, I just don't know if I'm safe. That was 6 months ago. That wasn't many years ago. That was recent. And he's a strong, capable, highly effective, confident man when he's in his comfort zone, which is the city of Asheville, literally leaving 20 minutes down the road. So watching that kind of experience in somebody's nervous system, I talk a lot about brains and nervous systems. And then also just back when I was a social worker in schools, and why were all the little children who were referred to me for behavior problems little black boys that needed to be different and act different and be put in a special class, or that I saw every day. And then working in the jails and prisons, realizing people are here because they're poor, and many people are people of color, but just so I've seen the structures play out, and I've seen individual experiences.
Yes, indeed. I'm getting ready to become 76 years old, and in my early life, in my young life, I lived in a segregated world. I wasn't conscious of integration or of racism or of some of these factors for a while because that wasn't the world I was living in. I did live on a farm after my father died. When Daddy died when I was 8. We moved to the top farm with my uncle when I was 10, and it was farmed by a black family who lived across the street. They worked across with us. David Lawrence, the son, was my age. We ate lunch at different tables. We worked together out in the fields, but we would be told that we should go our separate ways. I must confess that I would sneak David Lawrence up into the upstairs of the barn and play basketball or do other things, but I was aware that there was a difference and that we were being told that, quote from Uncle Jerry, who I loved, a wonderful man, "The Cardinals and the Blue Jays don't mate, Heath. Remember, you are separate. God created us to be separate." And so I think in some way as a child I started hearing racism in such examples. And then as I grew older, I am a product of the 60s, and I had the opportunity to see and watch so much change. I was the only white person to teach in Henrico County Schools, which is the county that surrounds Richmond, Virginia. I was invited to go in between years at seminary because Peggy was pregnant. In those days, women couldn't teach when they were pregnant. And they were wanting to integrate the schools. So I went there, and in the school, I wasn't aware of racism, but I was so aware of what my children and their parents faced outside of the school in the very county where I lived in ways that I had never seen before. And then throughout my life, there have been a number of instances, not only in the United States, but I've seen racism extraordinarily shown or played out in some of the countries that I have visited through my work or as moderator. I have been told to sit in the back seat of a car with one of my dearest friends in South Africa in 1983 because he said, I do not want anybody to think that we're friends if we're caught and I am your chauffeur. And those kinds of experiences over and over have helped to raise my awareness of racism and the power that people can have over other people.
At the same time, we hear this in private conversations, and we see it reflected in media, including perfectly respectable national media, but people are very often put off by what feels like dropping the word racist too easily. In other words, there's a sense, and I think there's a widespread sense that a lot of times it feels like if someone offers an opinion or an observation that doesn't fit into, say, the mainstream of particular thought, it seems like to a lot of people that word racism or racist is dropped perhaps too easily. Do you see any room for people either to pull back on what feels to many like a knee-jerk reaction, or is there some room to smooth that out a little bit, or is that something that can be dealt with?
I think yes. I think we can work together to do better. When we know better, we do better, and we're always learning and growing. I hope. At every age and stage. It's been helpful to me to try to stop and before I react or respond, if I'm feeling defensive, why is that? And rather than having to necessarily be right, can I learn something or do better? And it's hard work to reflect and look deeply at your own, biases and how you're showing up. It can be painful work, but I think it's what we're called to do as Christians, as human beings with hearts and souls and compassion. And so I think there are opportunities for us to grow together and sort of do our own work and do our work collectively, and to stay in relationship and connection in that work. The conversations will be hard. We're talking about pain, we're talking about death, we're talking about power over, we're talking about 500 years in this country of oppression and progress, and then maybe not as much progress as we thought. It's intense and it's painful, but it's work that I think we're called to do, and yes, as Christians, we can do this together.
I think one thing we learned fairly early on is that we can use words for our purposes, and oftentimes the same word can mean something different because of the ways in which we choose to use it. I think racist is one of those words, Keith. I know that all of us have seen that term used in ways that can be constructive, that can help identify some of what's going on, but we also have seen it used in a divisive way by both black and white people. Since so much of what we're talking about with racism today is black and white rather than some of the other possibilities of that. And so to use racist, there are two things. One, often we are not careful in thinking through how using a certain term might be heard or felt by someone else. And to say that someone is racist or that this is a racist attitude is often a tremendous slap in the face. On the other hand, there are times when we are in trusting relationships that I've needed to be told I'm acting in a racist way. And it hurts because that's never what I wanted to be, but I have acted that way. And so I think that we do need to be careful as we use terminology, especially something like racist and racism.
Some of the, an aspect of racism as it's felt and experienced by people is a sense not only of feeling threatened or being prejudicial, but an imbalance of power and an implied threat all the way up to and including physical threats of violence and even death. Ann DuPre, I'd like to toss this your way. If you could talk about the realities in your work of racialized traumas and traumas of oppression and how those can be dealt with.
So we know in a sort of neuroscience way, we are neurobiologically wired as human beings for connection first, because when we're infants, our survival depends on connection to our caregivers. So that need for connection and belonging never goes away, even when we're adults who don't need a caregiver. Our physiology, neurobiology is still that, connection and belonging. And then we're also neurobiologically wired for survival. When we are, because of structures or individual comments or people acting a certain way or systems leaving us out, it is threatening to our sense of connection and belonging and survival. So I think about the friend I was with driving one county over who was nervous. It was like his nervous system was on high alert, fight or flight. In his case, kind of flight, like he wanted to turn around and go home. And having to, and I just, here he's this big, strong man, right? And I'm thinking, you're having to be in a fear response right now because we're trying to go do our work in a county that may not receive you all that well because you don't look like them. And so his nervous system has to be on high alert sort of all the time. Maybe not all the time, but most of the time in a white world that he lives in. And his little children and his older children, he has to worry about them. As Dr. Lee talked about too, when his boys go out, he worries, will they come home safely? And all parents worry about their children. I'm not saying that, and Dr. Lee wasn't either, but to really be worried about their safety because of the color of their skin. That is something that as white people we just don't have to worry about that. There's plenty we can worry about, but that's not something we have to worry about. And so what does that sort of fight or flight response do to a nervous system, to a brain, to a body over time? It can have health effects just like other kinds of trauma can have lasting effects on the mind and body. It's like that, there's, whether it's a heart condition or high blood pressure or diabetes or some of the things that go along with stress, those things are compounded when you're a person of color in many situations. So I could go on, but that's the gist of it.
Heath, it sounds to me in Ann DuPre's work like a feeling that many white people are familiar with, that when we go into certain neighborhoods or when we're in certain places, and this comes from a variety of different people's observations, but sometimes we ourselves feel threatened and intimidated, and I'm aware that's been something that's been used against people of color for a long time, is just to be able to say the words, well, I felt threatened. But at the same time, there are some times when people have felt and have been threatened and felt intimidated going through different areas, neighborhoods, etc. You, in your travels, have been a lot of different places and probably seen a lot of things. Do you have any insights from that to share with us about? My sense is that for a lot of, let's say, African American people, is in the current discussion, they have that feeling constantly in, as Ann DuPre said, a white cultural society. Have you experienced or seen that in other places and in other ways?
Very much so, Heath. There have been a number of places where I've been assigned a guard to protect me, and my impulse was to say, I don't want a guard. And yet, I felt some fear. I knew that where I would be going might be threatening, and I didn't necessarily want to be a martyr. So it was, indeed, I have. But this gets to the core of some of what I've had to be dealing with lately, Keith, and so I'm going to move it into a very personal situation right now. I am so aware from conversations, two of my best friends who are also friends of this congregation are Paul Roberts in Atlanta and Brian Blunt in Richmond. And we have talked and shed tears over the pain that these two extraordinarily brilliant, capable, competent, highly acclaimed men have had to deal with, that in many times have shocked me. I had not ever thought about the fact that some of those things were impacting them to the extent they were. Part of me is ashamed of that. The other part of it has to recognize I'm a part of a system that has grown up and haven't had some of that put on my plate and didn't know it. So yes, I have seen this, and in light of the recent incidents with James Floyd, the fact that our whole society seems to be taking a new look or a revised look at what in the world is happening, and all of us, no matter where we are on a political spectrum or religious spectrum, are finding some confusion and some pain and some anxiety about where is all this going? What are we going to have to give up? What do we need to see? For me, one of my friends shared with me early on the best advice I've gotten, and that was, Heath, I can no longer look at these issues as an individual. All my life, I, as a Christian individual, have thought if I work my best to make a difference, that's going to be what can happen and do. And instead, she said, I now realize I am a part of a system, a lot of which I cannot impact, but is much greater than who I am as a person. And that flipped a light for me. I suddenly started realizing, often when I go, in the past, if I would have gone into a black area where I was concerned for my safety, I would think, I wish these people would not be as hostile or as angry. And yet, as Ann DuPre mentioned, and as we know psychologically, you can only push a person so far. You can only keep saying to a person, you're bad, you're wrong, and they not feel that about themselves before they're going to start reacting. And so I'm not excusing violence between any sets of people, but I am saying that I've learned more about the system that is causing this kind of reaction. And that's caused me to say, I might need to be afraid. I might need to see what it's like to be threatened in ways that I haven't in the past, because frankly, maybe it's my turn. And that's a hard, hard realization. And it's certainly not meant to be a judgment on everybody. That's my story, but I think it may be shared by some others.
I have had a similar experience lately, Heath, in that just the realization I can be the kindest, most loving, compassionate, caring person in the world who's never had a racist thought towards another. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, and I know I've had racist thoughts in my life, in my mind, hopefully not acted, but when you start to realize it's not enough just to not be racist yourself. And when you realize that, and you realize there are structures that have to be dismantled that are 500 years old, that is very overwhelming and intimidating, and you kind of just, my experience has been, what can I possibly do? And it can feel very discouraging and overwhelming. So that's been part of the pain, I would say, that I've experienced lately.
And Ann DuPre, I think we've been fortunate in this community. The Montreat Conference Center has done some wonderful programs in the last few years, helping us to look at these issues. I vividly remember one of our speakers at one of the conferences maybe 3 years ago, a woman who was speaking, and she said, if one more white person compliments me on my hair, I'm going to slap him in the face. And I thought, oh my lands, because she had braids and she had a very elaborate hairdo. And I thought, I have certainly spoken to black women and said, your hair is just beautiful. I thought I was complimenting them. It never occurred to me that they were hearing me say, you're different. Your hair is different. And I needed to hear that. But my heart wasn't in the wrong place. But the way I handled it in the system we live in wasn't proper. And so it's a whole different way of looking at things.
And I've had a couple of friends, acquaintances of colors call me out on things. Yes. And it is painful because you never want to be hurtful. You didn't mean it. But I have such gratitude for them, for their willingness to say, Ann DuPre, you shouldn't say it like that, and give me that opportunity to learn and do better. It's just been a gift. That is such a gift, and it is a trust relationship, and it's something that is a risk for those of us who put ourselves into the place. But I also think it underscores the critical importance of us personally getting to know and have relationships that can happen
with other people. I think that is just so important. And if we just talk about it, but we don't know these people, we aren't going to get but so far. We have to build a relationship so that they can insult us, but lovingly.
Right, exactly.
Because we need it. And when we think that most of them have been insulted their whole lives, then I surely need to get over any feelings of discomfort I would have.
So what is a racist? And what is racism? And my response to that question is this. I want to get people in a room and let us together come to a common definition of what that is. Because a lot of folk are throwing this language around. I can tell you from all of my theological studies that racism at its worst is when there is a group of people who deem themselves to be superior to another. But I think that will scare most of my white friends because they've not deemed themselves to be white supremacists. So I'm not a white supremacist, Bill, so can I be a racist and not be a white supremacist? I think we've got to have this conversation. It's just a little too complicated. For me to simply say, every white person is not a racist, but I know some racist white people. I'm going to tell you that. I know full well there are people who will never make me equal to George Anderson. I don't care what I've done in life. I don't care what I do in life. I'm going to always be colored. I said in honor of my father because my father never got past colored. He said that when they said we was black, he never got to be Negro. He just stayed at colored. He said, I just can't go no further. I said, okay, Pops, so I'm going to honor you. But I'm just saying clearly, we're going to have to sit down. I can go online and Google and give you the classic definition of racist. That's not going to help us where we are now. We're going to have to do some self-analysis. We're going to have to sit together in these rooms and say, okay, That's racism. Because even with that, folks don't understand the difference between systemic and institutional. Individually, you may love me dead, but you may vote for legislation that killed me. I was rereading Souls of Black Folk with W.E.B. Du Bois, and the question is raised by a person to him, what does it feel like to be a problem? And he said he's never answered that question. Then he goes on to say that the issue for the 20th century, it will be the color line. Well, it's 21st century now, and it's still a color line. He says something else in that book, and that's this whole business that's why we need to talk. I live a double conscious life. As a black person, I got to be two people in one world. You only have to be one person in one world. So we got to talk about that, because you're born white in a world that understands white. You don't have to do nothing about black. But I'm born black in a white world, and I got to be black in a white world, and I got to be double conscious. I can say a whole lot more about that. But it's tough living in a world where you got to be sometimes two people at one time and not lose your mind and not be called, not be labeled that will put you in some asylum. And I'm amazed that black people have managed to do it.
At one point, George Anderson asked Bill Lee, what's your view of people who don't believe they are racist but do have a bias against people of the other race? Dr. Lee mentioned that there are many people who love him personally but act in ways that support racism. He also said it's a complicated topic, and he said that as a black person, he has to be two persons in one world in a way, and these are his words, in a way that white people don't have to be what he called double conscious, living in a world where you have to be two people at one time, which is not just a philosophical matter, but a daily and lifelong challenge. I'll ask this of either of you. Do you see that reflected in the work that you do?
I do see it, and I hear about it from people of color that I've gotten to know and interact with. As recently as a week ago, I've got a new acquaintance, a woman who's a therapist and trainer and coach of equity kind of issues in Charlotte. And she's a black woman, and she described having to think about and sort of modulate herself in every setting she goes in that is a white space, which is mostly her experience, that she's one of the few people of color in a room. And whether it's I can't say too much or to talk too boldly because I'll be perceived as the angry black woman, or I have to be really, really friendly and kind, otherwise I'm perceived potentially as disgruntled. But she has to think about that before she speaks. She said, when I enter a room, I sort of have to evaluate how do I need to be showing up. And she is she's brilliant, and she's beautiful, and she knows more about everything I'm doing than I know. I mean, to me, I'm like, you should just be able to show up and say what you know and be who you are, because you know so much, and yet she's having to have this other dialogue with herself about how much of me can be in this room and how might that impact the white people that I'm interacting with. And so that was a week ago.
Dr. Lee said a couple of things that I found interesting in terms of what white people, including myself, have found to be aspects of dialogue that we can find intimidating. One was when he said that in intentional conversations, and this is a direct quote, "White America does not need to be overly sensitive to, quote, get everything right," unquote. And it was kind of like, because we don't have the relationships that we should have, he was suggesting, white people unintentionally say things that are offensive to black people all the time. And his counsel to black people in those conversations is to try to be patient and sensitive. He also made a request of white people, though, which was to have these conversations and build relationships with black people. And specifically, and I loved how he said this with a powerful purpose and good humor, he asked us to please stop falling apart if somebody says that something we say is racist. He said, frankly, that he and everyone he knows has been called by an intentionally demeaning word, and he didn't internalize the insult or essentially curl up in a ball. It struck me that he seemed to be kind of imploring white people in a way to toughen up enough to be vulnerable, to be willing to be vulnerable in these kinds of conversations and not gather up our toys and go home every time our own sensibilities are offended by being called racist or by having something we've said called a racist thing to say. Heath, you've been the head of the Red Cross, the president of a religious academic institution. You're on the board of a seminary. You were the moderator of the Peace U.S.A. You have been in countless situations where there have been crucial conversations, some life and death, and some with personal, interpersonal, and societal ramifications, conversations that not only touch on, but practically jump up and down on people's pain points. Do you have any thoughts that come to mind hearing Bill Lee asking us for relationships and conversations and fortitude?
Keith, I had two fairly strong reactions to his making that statement. The first one was genuine affirmation of the fact that it is something that we need to understand about ourselves, our relationships with one another. I can't speak to how black people should react or respond. I just don't have, that is not who I am. I don't know what the right answer is. But I do know as a white person that he's exactly right, that it is, we do tend to recoil, especially if we've wanted to be sensitive. Those of us who claim to be Christians, which is the group watching this video, none of us want to intentionally hurt our brothers. And we do claim them as brothers and sisters, but we tend to do it anyhow. And so the second part of my reaction was to disagree with him. And that is to say, in this instance, I feel like you're doing to me what I have been doing to you. You don't realize how it hurts me, who wants so badly not to be judged as someone who is hurting you or whatever. That hurts me too. Now, you have to be careful as a white person when we say that, because it is so easy for us to say it's all about me. And folks, it just isn't anymore. It isn't. In this instance, if we are close enough to somebody to say, don't recoil, don't feel horrible about it, well, I'm sorry, but if I've hurt somebody I love, I do feel sorry about it. So it's a balance that we have to come to in understanding who we are. And once again, it's those relationships that are key to making this possible.
I would just add maybe a couple of things. When I have been doing my own work in relationship with other people and alone, when I've had the opportunity to hear people say, you're doing the work, you aren't going to get it perfect or get it right every time, but to not do the work, to not take the risk, to not engage in the difficult conversations is leaving the burden on black people to carry this alone, and aren't we committed to better than that?
Absolutely.
And so I was invited to be on this panel. I'm doing something next week about race, and the invitation came from a black person, and I said, I just don't know if I'm not an expert on this. I've only gotten through some of the books there's 100 more books I should. And he said, Ann DuPre, you have to start somewhere, and to take the risk and be willing to go down the path together is the best that you can do.
And Ann DuPre, I want to compliment you in regard to that, because that is a statement of trust. And the other part of what I have been seeing and experiencing some is white people telling white people how we should behave and what we shouldn't do. And I know in the not too distant past, I did something and was shamed for it in a way that was embarrassing and inappropriate by another white person related to black. And it just was horrible. The reality is you have been able to encapsulate the things you've learned, well, and just who you are, your value system, and are able to go into a situation where you are trusted and black and white people can talk to you, even though there are going to be times you don't have those personal relationships, but we'll want to build them.
Thank you. I think there is no place for shame in any place when we shame each other about you're not woke enough or you're racist or you're whatever. Like when we start shaming one another, we drive disconnection, and we are again neurobiologically wired to be in connection, and so we can hold each other to a higher standard and call each other out for that was hurtful. Do you realize how that may have come across to you? We can say, Heath, I want you to read something or think about something in a different way that's not shaming, that doesn't just leave you feeling really maybe shut down or kind of in attack mode. There's no room for shame in any of this conversation. There's some room for guilt, but not shame.
Perfect. Perfect.
I want to say before I forget to say it, a sort of learning moment for me came about a year and a half ago. I was in a workshop experience, analysis about sort of the history of our country and sort of how structures are in place to both sort of keep people in power. And it's called the Racial Equity Institute. And in that, it's an analysis of our systems, and it's complex. It's not touchy-feely. It's emotional as you're learning all these policies, and but it's not meant to be about emotion or even about your own personal bias or not. It's an analysis of our structures. But in the beginning of the first day, it's a 2-day training. I highly recommend it. They started talking about the word diversity, which I had been using a lot of. Like, we need more diversity in my nonprofit. I want more diversity in my board or on my leadership team. And the question is, diverse from what? White is what you mean when you say diversity. And even that is really not okay, because why is white the norm and anything not white is diverse from? And so I'm now using the word inclusivity instead of the word diversity, because somebody said that's a better word to use. But I think about what Dr. Lee says, going back, way back to Keith's original question, is there is the world that we're living in is dominant white, and everything else is something else. And so as a white person, I have the privilege of being in the dominant. And so there are just experiences that my whiteness keeps me from having or allows me to have. So that was just something about that word, and the hearing that word isn't the best word.
It's helpful.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Ann DuPre, the other day you mentioned that this is a growth-oriented time. What do you see as fertile soil in the conversation on race and the possibilities for not just personal but societal transformation that may hold the promise that you kind of have been alluding to here, you and Heath both?
Well, I think our community, our country, our church, I think people are re-engaged around issues of race and justice recently, sadly because of a horrific filmed murder. But if not for it being in our face like that, I wonder, would the reaction be what it is? So I think absolutely there's fertile soil. People are talking about, whether it's around the dinner table or at church, such as it is. I feel like there's a re-engagement with the topic that I'm very hopeful about, and it is as heartbreaking as it is that there has to be gruesome death and murder and caught on video and shared to have an awakening. Well, it seems like it's happening, and in my neighborhood in West Asheville, I'm on this little email group, who needs an old bed frame or who has extra tomatoes, and also there's Black Lives Matter signs, if anybody wants one. Just there's and I don't live in a very inclusive neighborhood. I almost said diverse. There are a few black people in my neighborhood, mostly white people, mostly young-ish, middle-aged, hip, cool Asheville people, but we are having conversations in our neighborhood, and there is much fertile ground for growth. And if we keep people out of shame, if we stay in connection, if we hear one another, if somebody said the other day, sometimes in Asheville you can feel like you're in the woke Olympics. So trying to not do that, like I know more than you do, that is not going to get us anywhere. It's more like, have you seen this most recent book, or watch this film, or there's a lot out there. It can be overwhelming, but just trying to share resources and keeping the conversation open.
And on that note, Heath, you've talked about feeling a need to recenter yourself. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, this has been a real awakening for me, Heath, in terms of how I have thought of myself, and now how I am recognizing myself in a very different way. As I mentioned, that a lot of that has to do with this systemic issue, but also I keep seeking an anchor. What can I hold on to? What can I find that gives me a foundation, a basis that lets me know that that I'm secure in how I'm moving forward, and in who I am and who I think I'm supposed to be and called to be. Well, obviously there are many books that are out right now. Two that have been of extraordinary importance to so many has been the book White Fragility, and the other, Me and White Fragility. That second one is a 28-day almost devotional or class that a number of churches are using in order to help them look at themselves as a white congregation and how they might be more open to inclusiveness. But even more for me has been a re-examination of some Bible passages. And first of all, I thought that when Georgia and Dr. Lee were talking and brought up the great commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and then the second one, which is that we love each other as we love ourselves and more than we love ourselves. That's an important thing to keep foremost in our mind. Likewise, I found that the Beatitudes and the very familiar love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13, to take each of those words, patience and kindness, arrogance and rudeness, look at all of those words and apply them to me and how I am choosing to respond to whatever the situation is. None of that's new, but it is that I'm seeing it through new eyes.
You both are ordained elders in the Presbyterian Church, and obviously that faith means a great deal to you. Heath, you've just mentioned some things. Are there any other ways in which, ways that your faith informs your work and your personal prayers and everything else you seek to do in this context?
Well, certainly. I just believe that we're called as Christians to love our neighbor as ourselves. We end every church service at Montreat Pres with that. That's our departure. And so I just come back to that often. Also that, that sort of kitschy thing, what would Jesus do? That's all over the place. It's like, well, what would Jesus do?
Exactly.
What would Jesus want us to do? What would Jesus have to say about all of this? And it's pretty clear to me that inclusivity and love and acceptance and doing the hard work to dismantle the systems that aren't just, that was Jesus's work and call to us. I think it's pretty, and I won't try to quote scripture around that, but in summary.
Sure. I think that in my faith, and frankly, all of us who are Presbyterians, I would say all who are Christians, profess to saying that everyone is God's child. So if we start putting people in brackets, well, you're God's child. There was a T-shirt that I used when I was standing for moderator, and in my nomination speech, I held up, and it says, "Jesus loves you, but he loves me more." And when I first saw that, I was in Minneapolis. I remember walking through the mall and seeing that. I thought, that is so funny. And then about 10 steps down the road, I went, oh, that's horrible. And I went back and bought it because I thought, this I'm going to use somewhere. I had no idea I was going to ever be using it as a moderator candidate. But it is so true that Jesus doesn't love me more. Jesus loves me so completely and totally. There isn't any room for more love. But he loves this person right here and this person right here equally. And so my faith is very much the foundation of what I believe. And frankly, I think our denomination is very helpful in providing us with resources and opportunities to look and explore who we are as people of faith by a number of folks who've studied both theology and Bible and social justice issues and can provide guidance. We're called to make a difference.
Church and our community owe you, the two of you, a great debt of gratitude. You've shared yourselves and your perspectives and your knowledge, and I'm very much struck by the fact that for both of you together and each of you, what you've given us tonight is not a wrap-up or a summary or some sense of accomplishment, but a great starting point that you've helped us think through some things that are going to help us sort of get our foot on the next step of a long journey toward true relationship and an honest reflection of who we are as people of God and people in the world together. And I think we can't thank you enough for that. So thank you both tonight. Any concluding words? I'll start with Heath and then Ann DuPre. Any final thoughts?
I celebrate the fact that my other church, Montreat, is wrestling with this. I think that we are called as humans to wrestle. I would love to think that we were told at the beginning, if we accept Jesus, everything's going to be perfect and we're never going to have anything to worry about. And all of us know that's not true. And so it's critical that we take this on and that we wrestle with each other and we trust each other and we confront one another lovingly, not shaming, but lovingly, so that we can grow from each other, because that's one of the most significant ways God speaks to us.
And I would just say maybe begin, if you're not having the conversations, begin having them, practice. It does get easier. Maybe not easier. The more you just open your mouth and begin to speak. You're gonna get it wrong. You're gonna get it right. Just to begin the dialogue and stay open to one another's pain and love, and stay in connection, but continue to have the conversations. And you can start with the people you're closest to, because maybe that's the easiest, or that can be hard too. But I know that our Black brothers and sisters want us to be doing the work and having the conversation, even if we don't do it perfectly, to sort of help in carrying the burden by doing our own work.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Let's bow with a prayer. Almighty God, we thank you so much for gathering us together tonight and sending us out into the world, your world, to be your people. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.